In a quiet suburban town in the United States, where life moved at a slower pace and the air was filled with the scent of freshly cut grass and blooming flowers, there lived an elderly man named Mr. John at 70 years old. Mr. John was a man of simple means and humble aspirations. He lived alone in a small, weathered house on the edge of town, surrounded by a modest garden where he grew fresh vegetables. His wife had passed away many years ago, and his only son, David, had moved to the city to pursue a career. Despite his age and the physical toll of years of hard work, Mr. John refused to retire. He believed in the dignity of labor and found solace in his daily routine of tending to his garden and selling his produce at the local farmer's market. Every morning before the sun rose, Mr. John would wake up, brew himself a cup of coffee, and prepare for the day ahead. His hands, calloused and weathered from years of toil, carefully packed fresh bundles of lettuce, kale, and tomatoes into the back of his old, rusted pickup truck. The truck, a relic from decades past, was a testament to his resilience and resourcefulness. It had seen better days, but like Mr. John, it kept going, carrying the weight of his hard work to the market each day. For Mr. John, the farmer's market was more than just a place to sell his vegetables. It was a community hub, a space where he could connect with other vendors and customers, share stories, and feel a sense of belonging. The market was bustling with life, children running around, families shopping for fresh produce, and vendors calling out their daily specials. It was a stark contrast to the quiet solitude of his home, and Mr. John cherished these moments of human connection. However, life was not without its challenges. Mr. John's income from selling vegetables was modest at best, barely enough to cover his basic needs. Yet, he never complained. He took pride in his work and found joy in the simple act of contributing to his community. He often reminded himself that as long as he could stand on his own 2 feet, he would continue to work, not just for himself, but also to ease the burden on his son, David. David, on the other hand, was a young man in his early 30s, working tirelessly in the city to build a career. He loved his father deeply and often worried about him living alone and working so hard at his age. Despite his busy schedule, David made it a point to call his father regularly, urging him to slow down and take care of his health. But Mr. John, ever the stubborn and independent man, would always respond with a chuckle, saying, "I'm not ready to sit around doing nothing, son. Work keeps me alive." One crisp autumn morning, as the first rays of sunlight began to pierce through the horizon, Mr. John loaded his truck with freshly harvested vegetables and set off for the farmer's market. The air was cool and the streets were quiet, save for the occasional jogger or dog walker. Mr. John hummed a tune as he drove, his mind preoccupied with thoughts of the day ahead. He was looking forward to seeing familiar faces at the market and perhaps earning enough to treat himself to a warm cup of coffee from the local cafe. As he approached the market, the streets became busier, with cars lining up along the sidewalks and people bustling about. Mr. John carefully navigated his truck through the narrow lanes, mindful of the parked vehicles. But as he turned a corner near the entrance to the market, a sudden jolt shook the truck. Startled, he hit the brakes and looked in his rearview mirror. His heart sank as he saw a sleek, black Tesla Model S parked on the side of the road, now bearing a long scratch along its shiny exterior. Panic set in as Mr. John stepped out of his truck to assess the damage. The scratch was unmistakable, running along the side of the car, like a glaring reminder of his mistake. His hands trembled as he adjusted his glasses and looked around, hoping no one had noticed. But it was too late. A few passers-by had stopped to see what had happened, their curious eyes fixed on the scene. Mr. John's face flushed with embarrassment as he bent down to pick up the vegetables that had fallen from his truck during the impact. "I'm so sorry," he muttered under his breath, his voice barely audible. He knew the car must have cost a fortune, far more than he could ever afford to repair. The thought of having to pay for the damage made his chest tighten. He felt a wave of helplessness wash over him, but he quickly composed himself. Taking a deep breath, he resolved to take responsibility for his actions, no matter the cost. As he was gathering the scattered vegetables, the door of the Tesla swung open, and a young man in his late 20s stepped out. Dressed sharply in a tailored suit, the man's face was a mix of anger and disbelief. His name was Mark, the driver of the Tesla and an employee of the car's owner. Mark's voice cut through the morning air like a knife. "What the hell were you thinking?" he shouted, his tone sharp and accusatory. "Do you have any idea how much this car costs? You think you can just scratch it and walk away?" Mr. John straightened up, his hand still clutching a bundle of lettuce. "I'm sorry, sir," he said softly, his voice steady despite the fear bubbling inside him. "It was an accident. I didn't mean to." "An accident?" Mark interrupted, his voice rising. "Do you even know how much it'll cost to fix this? Can you even afford it?" The commotion began to draw more attention, with a small crowd gathering around the scene. Mr. John felt the weight of their stares, his face growing hotter with each passing second. He wanted to explain, to make things right, but Mark's relentless accusations left him no room to speak. "I'll pay for the repairs," Mr. John finally said, his voice firm despite the lump in his throat. "Just tell me how much it'll cost, and I'll figure it out." Mark scoffed, crossing his arms. "Figure it out? With what? Selling vegetables? You'll be paying this off for the rest of your life." The words stung, but Mr. John refused to let them break his spirit. He stood his ground, determined to take responsibility for his mistake, even if it meant sacrificing everything he had. Little did he know, this seemingly small incident would soon take an unexpected turn, one that would change his life and the lives of those around him forever. The tension in the air was palpable as the small crowd around Mr. John and Mark grew larger. People whispered among themselves, their curious eyes darting between the scratched Tesla and the elderly man standing beside his old pickup truck. Mr. John's weathered face was flushed with embarrassment, but he stood firm, clutching the bundle of lettuce in his hands. He had always believed in taking responsibility for his actions, and this moment was no different. Yet deep down, he couldn't help but feel overwhelmed. The scratch on the Tesla was long and glaring, and he knew that repairing such a luxury car would cost more than he could ever afford. Mark, on the other hand, was relentless. His sharp words cut through the murmurs of the crowd as he continued to berate Mr. John. "You shouldn't even be driving if you can't handle a truck like that," he snapped, pointing at the old pickup. "Do you know how much trouble you've caused? People like you shouldn't be on the road." Mr. John's hands trembled slightly, but he kept his voice calm. "I'm sorry, sir. I truly didn't mean to cause any harm. I'll do whatever I can to make this right." Mark rolled his eyes, his frustration evident. "Make it right? How? You think selling a few vegetables will cover the cost of this repair? This car is worth more than your entire truck." The crowd began to murmur louder, some shaking their heads at Mark's harsh words. A few people whispered in defense of Mr. John, their voices filled with sympathy for the elderly man. "He's just an old man," one woman said softly. "It was an accident. There's no need to humiliate him like this." But Mark was too caught up in his anger to notice. He stepped closer to Mr. John, his voice rising. "You're going to pay for this, old man? I don't care how long it takes. You can't just walk away from something like this." Before Mr. John could respond, a new voice cut through the commotion. It was calm, firm, and carried an air of authority. "What's going on here?" The crowd parted slightly, and a woman stepped forward. She was dressed elegantly in a tailored navy blue suit, her heels clicking softly against the pavement as she approached. Her presence commanded attention, and even Mark seemed to shrink slightly under her gaze. This was Ms. Elizabeth Carter, the owner of the Tesla and Mark's employer. Ms. Carter's sharp eyes scanned the scene, taking in the scratched car, the scattered vegetables, and the elderly man standing quietly beside his truck. Her expression was unreadable as she turned to Mark. "Mark," she said, her voice steady but laced with a hint of disapproval, "what's all this commotion about?" Mark hesitated, his earlier confidence faltering. "Miss Carter, this man, he scratched your car. Look at the damage. I was just trying to handle the situation." Miss Carter's gaze shifted to Mr. John, who stood silently, his head slightly bowed. She noticed the trembling in his hands, the weariness in his eyes, and the quiet dignity in the way he carried himself. "Is that true?" she asked, her tone softening as she addressed Mr. John. "Yes, Mom," Mr. John replied, his voice steady despite the lump in his throat. "It was an accident. My truck brushed against your car as I was turning the corner. I'm truly sorry. I'll pay for the repairs, even if it takes me a long time." For a moment, Ms. Carter said nothing. She studied Mr. John carefully, her expression thoughtful. Then, she turned back to Mark, her voice suddenly sharp. "And you thought the best way to handle this was to yell at an elderly man in front of a crowd? Is that how I've taught you to represent me?" Mark's face turned red, and he stammered, I was just trying to." "Enough," Ms. Carter interrupted, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Step back. I'll handle this." Mark reluctantly stepped aside, his shoulders slumping. Ms. Carter turned her attention back to Mr. John, her expression softening once more. "Sir," she said gently, "are you hurt? Did the accident cause you any harm?" Mr. John shook his head. "No, Ma, I'm fine. I just feel terrible about your car. I know it's expensive, and I'll do whatever I can to make it right." Ms. Carter smiled faintly, a hint of warmth breaking through her otherwise composed demeanor. "I appreciate your honesty, but let's not make this a bigger issue than it needs to be. It's just a scratch. Cars can be fixed. What matters more is that no one was hurt." The crowd, which had been watching intently, began to murmur in agreement. A few people nodded, their expressions softening as they saw the situation de-escalate. Miss Carter's calm and measured response seemed to diffuse the tension in the air. But Mark, still standing nearby, couldn't resist speaking up. "Ms. Carter, with all due respect, this man should still be held accountable. If we let this go, what kind of message does that send? People will think they can damage property and get away with it." Miss Carter's eyes narrowed slightly as she turned to face Mark. "Accountability doesn't mean humiliating someone, Mark. It means handling situations with respect and understanding. This man has already taken responsibility for his actions. That's more than enough." Mark opened his mouth to respond but quickly closed it when he saw the look in Miss Carter's eyes. She turned back to Mr. John, her voice softening once more. "Sir, I don't want your money. I don't need you to pay for the repairs. But I would like to hear more about what happened. Can you tell me your side of the story?" Relieved by her kindness, Mr. John nodded. He explained how he had been on his way to the farmer's market, how his old truck had brushed against the Tesla as he turned the corner, and how he had immediately stopped to take responsibility. His voice was steady, but there was a hint of sadness in his tone as he spoke about his limited means and his willingness to do whatever it took to make amends. Ms. Carter listened intently, nodding occasionally but never interrupting. When he finished, she smiled gently. "Thank you for being so honest, Mr. John. I can see that you're a man of integrity, and I want you to know that I respect that." The crowd, which had been silent during Mr. John's explanation, began to murmur again. Many of them were impressed by his humility and Ms. Carter's fairness. One woman in the crowd spoke up, her voice filled with admiration. "It's rare to see someone handle a situation like this with so much grace. Both of you are setting an example for the rest of us." Ms. Carter turned to the woman and smiled. "Thank you. But I believe it's Mr. John who deserves the credit. He's shown us all what it means to take responsibility, even in difficult circumstances." As the crowd began to disperse, Ms. Carter reached into her purse and pulled out a crisp business card. She handed it to Mr. John with a warm smile. "If you ever need anything, don't hesitate to reach out. And if you'd like, I'd be happy to buy some of your vegetables. They look fresh and delicious." Mr. John hesitated for a moment before accepting the card. "Thank you, ma'am. That's very kind of you." Miss Carter nodded. "It's the least I can do. And please, don't worry about the car. It's just a scratch. What matters most is how we treat each other." As she turned to leave, Mr. John felt a wave of relief wash over him. He clutched the business card tightly in his hand, grateful not only for Miss Carter's kindness but also for the lesson she had taught everyone that day, that compassion and understanding are far more valuable than material possessions. As the crowd dispersed and the commotion settled, Mr. John stood by his old pickup truck, still clutching the business card Ms. Carter had handed him. The morning sun was now higher in the sky, casting a warm glow over the street, but Mr. John's heart felt even warmer. He had expected the worst: a hefty repair bill, humiliation, and perhaps even legal trouble, but instead, he had encountered something rare: kindness and understanding. Miss Carter's words echoed in his mind. What matters most is how we treat each other. For a moment, Mr. John simply stood there, reflecting on what had just happened. He looked down at the card in his hand. It was simple yet elegant, with Ms. Carter's name embossed in gold letters, Elizabeth Carter, CEO, Carter Enterprises. Beneath her name was a phone number and an email address. Mr. John didn't know much about big businesses or CEOs, but he could tell that Miss Carter was someone important. Yet, despite her status, she had treated him with respect and dignity, something he hadn't expected from someone who owned a car as luxurious as the Tesla. As he climbed back into his truck, he noticed that a few of his vegetables had been damaged in the commotion. Some of the lettuce leaves were torn, and a few tomatoes had been squashed. He sighed, knowing that this would mean fewer sales at the farmer's market that day. But even so, he felt a sense of gratitude. The situation could have been much worse, and he was thankful for Ms. Carter's generosity. Later that afternoon, As Mr. John was unloading the remaining vegetables at the farmer's market, his son David arrived unexpectedly. David had driven all the way from the city after receiving a frantic call from one of the market vendors who had witnessed the incident. He rushed over to his father, his face filled with concern. "Dad, are you okay?" David asked, his voice tight with worry. "I heard what happened. Why didn't you call me?" Mr. John smiled faintly, wiping his hands on his worn-out jeans. "I didn't want to bother you, son. It was just a little accident. Everything's fine now." "Fine." David's voice rose slightly. "You scratched a Tesla, Dad. Do you know how expensive those cars are? What if they had sued you? What if?" "David," Mr. John interrupted gently, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. "It's okay. The owner of the car, Ms. Carter, was very kind. She didn't ask for any money. She said it was just a scratch, and that what mattered more was how we treat each other." David blinked, his anger and worry slowly giving way to confusion. She didn't ask for anything, not even to pay for the repairs. Mr. John shook his head. "No, son. She even gave me her business card and said I could reach out to her if I ever needed help." David stared at his father, his expression softening. He had always admired his father's honesty and humility, but he had also worried that those qualities might make him vulnerable in a world that often seemed harsh and unforgiving. Yet here was proof that kindness and integrity still had a place in the world. "Let me see the card," David said, holding out his hand. Mr. John handed it to him, and David's eyes widened as he read the name. "Elizabeth Carter, the CEO of Carter Enterprises. Dad, do you have any idea who this is? She's one of the most successful businesswomen in the country." Mr. John shrugged, a small smile playing on his lips. "She's just a kind woman who treated me with respect. That's all that matters to me." David couldn't help but smile at his father's simplicity. "You're incredible, Dad," he said, shaking his head. "Only you could turn a situation like this into something positive." A few days later, David decided to reach out to Ms. Carter. He wasn't sure what to expect, but he felt compelled to thank her personally for the way she had treated his father. He sent her an email, expressing his gratitude and explaining how much her kindness had meant to their family. To his surprise, Ms. Carter responded almost immediately, inviting him to meet her at her office in the city. When David arrived at the sleek, modern headquarters of Carter Enterprises, he felt a mix of nervousness and excitement. He was greeted warmly by Ms. Carter, who remembered him from the incident with his father. She invited him into her office, where they spoke at length about his career, his aspirations, and the values his father had instilled in him. "I can see where you get your integrity from," Ms. Carter said with a smile. "Your father is an extraordinary man. It's rare to meet someone so honest and humble these days." David felt a swell of pride as he listened to her words. "Thank you, Ms. Carter. My dad has always taught me to do the right thing, no matter how hard it is." "Ms. Carter nodded thoughtfully. "That's a lesson more people need to learn. And I believe people like you, people with strong values, can make a real difference in the world. I'd like to offer you a position here at Carter Enterprises. I think you'd be a great fit for our team." David was stunned. He hadn't expected anything more than a polite conversation, but here he was, being offered an opportunity that could change his life. He accepted the offer with gratitude, promising to work hard and make his father proud. Back in the small suburban town, Mr. John continued his daily routine of tending to his garden and selling vegetables at the farmer's market. He didn't fully understand the magnitude of the opportunity Ms. Carter had given David, but he was happy to see his son thriving. For Mr. John, life was about the simple joys, the feel of soil beneath his hands, the laughter of children at the market, and the satisfaction of a hard day's work. One afternoon, as he was packing up his stall, he noticed a familiar figure approaching. It was Ms. Carter, dressed casually in jeans and a sweater, carrying a reusable shopping bag. She smiled warmly as she greeted him. "Mr. John," she said, "I thought I'd stop by and see how you're doing, and I couldn't resist buying some of your vegetables. They look even better than last time." Mr. John chuckled, his face lighting up with a smile. "Thank you, ma'am. It's good to see you again." As they chatted, Ms. Carter shared how much she admired his resilience and work ethic. "You've reminded me of something important," she said. "That no matter how successful we become, we should never forget the value of kindness and hard work." Mr. John nodded, his eyes twinkling. "And you've reminded me that there are still good people in the world, Mom. Thank you for that." As Ms. Carter walked away with her bag of fresh vegetables, Mr. John felt a deep sense of contentment. The events of the past week had taught him and everyone involved a powerful lesson that kindness, respect, and understanding could bridge even the widest gaps between people. And in a world that often seemed divided, those values were more important than ever. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video. Your support means the world to us, and we truly appreciate you being here. We hope this story has inspired you, reminded you of the power of kindness, and the importance of treating others with respect and compassion. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more meaningful stories like this. And of course, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Feel free to leave a comment below and let us know what you think or share your own experiences.